Hello everyone. This is a presentation by Group 5 and today we're going to talk about traditions and God's law based on Mark 7 verse 1 to 23. So I assume that you have read the passage. After you read it, I want you to think, who is Jesus in this passage? What kind of role or what is his identity in this passage? So I want you to think for a second. You can write it down on your notes later on. This will be very helpful because we're going to discuss further about this question in the activity. Okay. So now that you have answer or think about the question, I also want you to take notes on these key terms. So kind of make like a table on your notes. So I'll write down elders and teachers, korban, clean and unclean, the traditions of the elders. So this will be very helpful also at the end of this presentation. There will be an activity. So you can try to fill it out. Try to think of like what does it mean? What does these words mean in my cultural context or my cultural situations? Okay, so now we're going to talk about our objectives. So first, you will explain the identity of Jesus in Mark 7, verse 1 to 23 to questions and answers. So later on, there will be some questions that you have to answer in the forum or in the comment section, and it's about the identity of Jesus. Also, you will also reflect on your own situation or on your own home country context about traditions in relation to God's law. Okay, so this is the outline for today. The first one, we will talk about context of the book of Mark and the passage. And then the second one, we will talk about the main points or the principles in this passage. And then afterwards, we will reflect on our cultural situations and also conclude the presentation. Okay, so first one, what is the biblical context, historical or cultural context that will be helpful for us to understand the passage?
Okay. Thank you, Deborah, for introduction and opening. And before we go to the context of the passage, I want you guys to look at the context of the book. So this may help you to build a big picture, and later on you can connect it with our passage and to see the connection between. So the book is written by John Mark, addressed to the Gentiles in the way it tells about Jesus as a Messiah. So this is the focus of the whole book, Jesus as a Messiah, and the Son of God in serving the ministry among the Gentiles and the Jews. Especially in the first 8 chapters of Mark, you can see Jesus has another role of healer. So he came to people and healed peoples. So this will be more specifically talked about in our passage. And another thing related to our passage is the part of Jesus' ministry was to rebuild the misconceptions among the society, especially in Judaism. So misconception here is more about clean and unclean. Lydia will explain more about that.
Thank you, Leah, for explaining the background of Book of Mark. Now we're going to narrow it down to the context of the passage itself, where we're going to talk about where is the place where it taken, and we're going to talk about Korban as part of their tradition too, and the tradition of the elders too, and also the clean and unclean. Now, the first one is the Pharisees and the scribes. So, this passage specifically took place in Galilee, and Jesus was there with his disciples on the ministry journey. The Pharisees and the scribes were 100 miles away from Jerusalem and came specifically really far to Galilee, already with the plot to kill Jesus. They came to oppose Jesus, who had a reputation there because of his teachings and his healing ministry at that particular moment. And the Pharisees and the scribes, they're trying to put Jesus on a test. They were there to observe Jesus and his disciples. And at this event, which recorded by the gospel, they were trying to see the way Jesus observed the traditions of the elders by washing hands and cups. They were trying to make Jesus feel guilty by questioning the behavior of his disciples as Jewish.
So now we're going to talk about Corban. According to a note in the Net Bible, person who made this claim was absolved from responsibility to support his parents, which is a violation to Mosaic law to honor one's parents. So basically, this means that, for instance, the children, out of anger or for whatever reason it is, they dedicated their money, their possessions to God. Korban basically means gift. So they already made a vow, and the Pharisees or the Jews will not let these children take it back to support their parents. So basically, the Jews hindered these children to honor their parents, which is God's law.
This has never been mentioned in the Torah about this particular tradition. The background of this tradition of the elders was after the destruction of the Second Temple, the Council of Yavne reinvented Judaism, and one of the results was the replacement of the animal sacrifices and the temple rituals with the prayer and good deeds. There were 6 orders of the recorded debates of the post-temple sages. One of those discussed about purities or tohorot, about vessels, food, dwellings, and people. And this practice is what Mark is trying to say in his commentary. The tradition were somehow taken as an equal obligation with the scripture by the Pharisees and their followers. So instead of holding on to the obedience to God's commandment, they hold on to the traditions of the elders, which no longer obeying God's commandment, but in the way they thought it honors God through the tradition of the elders.
The clean and unclean mentioned in this passage actually is related to one of the tradition that Lydia talked about just now. So in the beginning of the passage, Pharisees and scribes they question Jesus and disciples, hey, you guys don't wash your hands and then you eat food. So when we go back to the Old Testament, especially in Leviticus chapter 11 to 14 or 15, so there talks about the skin disease, the food, the animals, the vessels, and even the building, the housing, how to make it clean and to keep it holy. But there's no way talk about washing hands before eating, and if you don't do that, it's a sin. It's not included in the Torah. So in this case, definitely with using defiled hands to eat meals, actually it's not a sin. What really is sinful and it's very serious in God's eyes is that you bring the uncleanness into the holy place, like the tabernacle and the temple. So after knowing this context, now we are going to explain some main points. So about the principles that we can learn from the passage.
Now, the spirit of the law. Why are we obeying God's law and why should we? It is actually to build the relationship. In this passage, we are remembering the purpose of God's law itself, which is to establish the covenant relationship with His people. Our response to this covenant is simply obedience, not because we're trying to look good or be good, but because God has made us good. God has set the law to keep His people holy, because God Himself is holy. Yet, when Jesus came, He Himself is the fulfillment of the law. He turns the unholy to holy and to the unclean heart to a clean heart, which we are going to talk next. Now, the contradiction between the traditions and God's commandments. We know that the Pharisees and the scribes thought that they were honoring God through a strict obedience of written and oral law. But in reality, the Pharisees and the scribes put their traditions on top of God's law. They do not really worship God simply because they observe the tradition over God's law. And it's an irony for them because they're actually the teachers of the law. And the fact that they honor the traditions that they set aside God's commandment, it makes Jesus sad. But that's the time when Jesus finally rebukes these false teachers by giving them real teaching to the real people, which is the Gentiles and the Jews. And it leads us to the clean heart. We know how important it is to have a clean heart to honor his commandments. And Jesus emphasized what makes us defiled or unclean is actually from the heart itself. Although we are practicing or somehow obeying the commandment of God, yet if our heart is far from God or far from the idea of worship, then we are actually obeying God's law in vain. Jesus on his ministry has been transforming people's lives. He's transforming our hearts too, so that we can worship him with this clean heart. And it is very significant for us to check our heart, whether we seek God to worship or are we truly devoting ourselves to him in the way we live.
Okay, so before I go to the next point, I want to ask you guys two questions. The first one, based on the big picture, the context we have introduced, how does Jesus play the role of Messiah in this passage? And how do cleanness and uncleanness connect to Jesus in Mark 7, 1-23? So I'll give you guys 1 minute to think about these two questions. You can take notes on your own piece of paper, or you can write the comments below the videos or in the forum on Moodles. So you can do either way. And we may give the feedback later. Okay, time's up. So guys, don't forget to write your comments and give it to us. So I believe you guys already got some ideas in your mind. Now I'm just gonna explain a little bit more about the identity of Jesus here. So Jesus, as I already said, we already mentioned, as a Messiah, which is the focus of the book of Mark here. He's a Holy One as Messiah, the Son of God, came to heal and restore the unholy one, which is Jews at that time. And Jesus, also as a teacher, he came to guide the people in how to be holy according to God's commandment, which is to lead Jews at that time to really obey God's commandment. Because at that time, the people there, the Pharisees, the scribes, the Jews, they have misunderstood God's commandment as God's law. So they went to the wrong way of being holy. And especially the Pharisees and the scribes at that time, they are people who are supposed to be holy because they are the servant of God. They came close to the temple. And the Pharisees, they are the person who offers a sacrifice to Lord. They must be holy. In fact, but actually they didn't. They were not, because they concentrate more on ceremonial cleanliness rather than obeying God's law. And this is already a sin in God's eyes. And for us, even like after 1,000 years, we as Christians, we need to obey God's law as well in some way. And we know that it's very hard for us to fully obey and to fully follow the commandments. It's a challenge for us, but we have the hope. As Jesus, the Holy One, intervened to unclean people, and he came to approach us and to lead us in the right way. So through him, we can go back to the original state that God created us in the beginning. Now we are going to have some fun activity.
Thank you, Leah. So now we are going to reflect on our home situations or cultural contexts. So these are some questions that you need to reflect on in relation to our passage. So, first one, what are some of the traditions from your home country that contradict with God's law? And how does it violate God's law? Another one is what kind of solutions can you offer to honor the traditions yet to obey God's commandment at the same time? Or if it's not possible to do both of them, which one will you pick? How will you do it and why? So please leave a comment or type your answers in the forum so that we can give a feedback later on. So I'm going to give you an example. So this is kind of a culture that some of the Indonesians practice. So they say excuse me when they arrive at new places to honor the spirits of the ancestors, meaning that they don't want to be bothered by the spirits. So they were just being polite, like I don't want them to disturb me, so I have to say excuse me so they will not disturb.
Our response to this is because our God ordered us not to have other gods. I believe that we should not practice this tradition. We should not fear the spirit because God is sovereign. So, how do we respond this individually? So instead of living in fear, we should pray to our God and rely on him. And for others, how should we respond to this? And we can question ourselves. How should we not cause others to stumbles? And how should we not cause ourselves to stumble on this kind of situation? So for example, would you say excuse me without really honoring their spirit, or would you not say it at all just because you're not trying to cause others to stumble, or to you yourself not to stumble?
Okay, so what have you learned so far from this class? So these are some rhetorical questions that you can think about. What is the message of the text and how will you apply the message into your daily lives? So these are the objectives that we have accomplished for today. You have explained the identity of Jesus in Mark 7 from the questions. So we will check your comments later on. And also you have reflected on your own cultural situations in regards of the traditions and God's law. Okay, so for the conclusion, the first point is the legalistic Jews who taught that they were the holy ones were actually defiled. So as we already mentioned earlier, that the Jews actually burdened themselves by these oral traditions or the traditions that is not that there are not God's law. So they were actually just honoring themselves because they made the traditions. It's not about God, it's about themselves. So that's why they were defiled. They were not the holy ones. And that's when Jesus came.
Now, Jesus, as the healer and the restorer of holiness, we know that holiness is not supposed to touch the defiles, and holiness consumes the unholy. Jesus, as the Holy One, is touching and purifying the unclean, and Jesus is reaching out to response. What about the Pharisees? The Pharisees was worrying about the fake unclean, and it's not even unclean. The core of this gospel is that people who supposed to be clean are those who are actually defiled. But Jesus takes those who are already defiled to be clean. Jesus is restoring what is right. He prepares the Jews to accept the Gentiles and those who are considered as unclean or unholy, especially to the address audience of the book of Mark, who are actually Gentiles. They are now welcome to the kingdom because Jesus has purified them.
Exactly. And besides that, Jesus is a teacher who guides people in a correct way of living God's commandment. So Jesus was not only to restore people and leave them there, he also guides us and lead us into the right way to close to God. And as today, as Christians, when we read in the Bible, it's the Word of God, and when we read the Gospel books, it's Jesus. He's showing us like how to be really to be holy and how to really worship God. And so we need to check on ourselves and reflect on ourselves and to see if we are really living in the right way. So these are the questions we need to think about. And I believe that's all the presentation for today. And thank you for watching. And please don't forget, again, don't forget to write the comments and or to write yourself and give it to us. And this is our references. Thank you.